Oh my god. Guys, this is Taoran. I have been waiting to see this man once again for a year. It has been so long. I remember we finished the Lawful Part 1 questline, and a lot of people would say, oh, the Lawful story is over after Jingliu's quest, but nah. To those people I said, we haven't even met the main villains of the Lawful plot. There is not a single chance the Lawful story is done. But now we have. Oh, Preceptor Taoran. I have missed you so badly, my villainous friend. Also, excuse me, sir, that is quite the glow up. There is so much for me to talk about, but first, let us take a moment to bask in the glory that is Preceptor Taoran. I actually hate his guts, by the way, but I have waited for so long for his villain reveal. Just please, let me have this. Okay, I think I have recovered. Let's get a bit more serious now. So, who is this guy, and why did a mere mention of him send me absolutely feral, screaming at anyone who would listen to me? Well, it's the guy who is probably behind the sedition and the entire reason that Dunfeng was imprisoned. Yeah, this is him, the actual bad guy. He's also the narrator of the Exodus of the Five Dragons Myriad trailer, with his confession to releasing the Boris, and his affiliation to the Disciples of Sanctus Medicus is more or less completely confirmed, which means he is in fact part of the group that was experimenting to create the artificial High Elder alongside Danshu and her Vidyadhara predecessor, aka the woman who did all those crazy experiments and created Bai Lu. Just after the execution of Dunfeng, the preceptors held a meeting to discuss how Vidyadhara were going to rule moving forward. Dunfeng's teacher Xuepu wanted to move towards a council, but Preceptor Taoran resisted her and claimed Dunfeng's imprisonment is his own fault and has nothing to do with the succession of High Elders, knowing full well that the preceptors are the ones who told him how to create a new High Elder, which, by the way, is a really weird thing for them to do considering they don't even have the secrets of the Transmutation Arcanum. Let me just read out this entire paragraph. It's hysterical. Lady Xuepu, you have served as one of Dunfeng's tutors during his development phase. The disasters he has waged are now inextricably linked to the indulgence of you, his teachers. Dunfeng's imprisonment is his own fault and has nothing to do with the succession of High Elders. I shall repeat, the ancestors have formulated laws and these cannot be changed. Our solemn responsibility is to confiscate the Transmutation Arcanum and the Orb of Abysm from Dunfeng to uphold the continuation of the Iker lines. Your bold suggestion of preceptors entangling in political activity is the height of malice, he said, like a liar, and then proceeded to let the literal IPC into Dunfeng's prison and give them secrets about the permanence for literally what reason? And how dare he say the High Elders too bear mortal frailties when the preceptors literally guided Dunfeng to the mistake that caused the abomination? This guy... Are you starting to get why I said I hate his guts? I knew he was evil because he was clearly depicted with the horns of a High Elder, and with his focus on the whole give up the Transmutation Arcanum thing, it was just very obvious he was part of the group trying to create High Elders even before Dunfeng was compromised. He resisted the rule of the Preceptor Council, involved himself in sketchy High Elder experiments, and brought the IPC to Dunfeng in prison. He just reeked of plotting villain energy. And he looked exactly like the suspicious figure present at the sedition that was doing something to the water ball, but just without the horns. Plus, his de-aging glow-up and loss of a horn is so interesting to me because he was already quite old during the sedition time, which means he should have had a rebirth, yet clearly retains the exact same identity and only half of his power, and boy oh boy, doesn't that sound awfully familiar. Now, this is just me speculating, but it's very possible that those who messed around with Transmutation Arcanum are just now unable to rebirth properly anymore. Perhaps that makes them effectively immortal, and would he too turn into water if you stabbed him through the chest? I am so excited about Taoran. And I never imagined he would show up youthful with only one horn. Really, showing something is very faulty, most likely from all those experiments. And you might be thinking, well, what if preceptors just normally have horns? They don't. At least, The mural in the Scale Gorge depicts Yubia moving the sea to suppress the arbor, and for this event he was aided by 100 preceptors depicted behind him. None of these people are shown with horns. It briefly crossed my mind that perhaps Vidyadhara normally will have some draconic features and only High Elders have all of them or something, but then I remembered that neither Bailu nor Dunhung have the scales visible on their hands and legs, and the horns atop his head are identified as being for a High Elder. Speaking of the Scale Gorge mural, you can also see it briefly in the background of the brief shot of Dunhung throwing a spear, so I am praying and hoping this is potentially a scene where Dunhung confronts Preceptor Taoran, and maybe he remembers something. Don't forget that one Mirage who said Dunhung's enemies had been waiting for him in the Scale Gorge. I'm also extremely curious about the politics, because on one hand, Lingsha's banished master should be Danshu's predecessor, aka the person who did all those experiments inspired by Dunfeng, but on the other hand, Yunhua is identified as a cauldron master, where the predecessor is called a chief alchemist, and I'm not sure if those titles were both held by the same person or not, yet Yunhua was in fact the person in charge preceding Danshu's takeover. It's confusing, but hopefully we will find out soon what the deal is here. Either way, there seems to be drama between Taoran and Lingsha, so I'm very, very curious to see where these ever-complicated Vidyadhara politics go. Don't forget, Yunhua left the lawful because of disputes between the Vidyadhara and Danshu's letters with Goldchurn, which took place after the Third Abundance War, so less than 30 years ago, depicted actual fighting in the Scale Gorge that made it unsafe for them to keep Bailu there, so they had to hand her over to the Alchemy Commission. I'm not going to re-explain every little thing in this video, but if you want to learn about the Alchemy Commission and how Dunfeng was actually innocent and set up by this guy and his friends, please watch my 2 Bloomborn Scion videos where I go into way too much detail about Bailu's creation, Danshu's shenanigans, and later the events of the sedition. I'll make a follow-up video to the Bloomborn Scion series once we know more and have some juicy lore books for me to chew into, so make sure you are subscribed so you can be here when that comes out. Bye!